Some of the most beautiful places on Earth are also the most dangerous, and in some of them, a single mistake is all it takes. A lake that looks hand-painted, yet is too chemical for most forms of life. An ocean that glows in the dark, but reacts to every movement. And an isolated island, where evolution followed its own unpredictable path. Nothing in these places happens by accident. Behind every perfect-looking landscape, there's a limit being pushed. Temperature, pressure, toxicity, isolation. There's always something turning the environment into a real risk. And the most surprising part isn't the danger. It's that, even under those conditions, life still exists, just in ways we don't expect. There's a common idea that the planet has already been fully explored, as if nothing truly surprising was left. But that changes quickly when you look closer. There are still places that completely break the pattern. Landscapes that feel too extreme to be natural. Colors that don't seem to belong. Environments where survival is never simple. Sometimes it's heat. Sometimes it's cold. In other cases, it's chemistry or geography pushing everything to the edge. And yet, life finds a way, but only by adapting to the limit. In this journey, we're going through 25 of these places. 25 real environments where nature operates outside the norm, each one testing how far adaptation can go. And as these places connect, a pattern begins to emerge. The more extreme the environment, the more precise survival needs to be. If this kind of exploration pulls you in, well, it's worth staying until the end, because some of these places don't just look impossible. They challenge everything we think we understand. And it all begins with a place that looks like a mistake in the landscape. A pink lake, isolated, where almost nothing should survive. But it does. The first place doesn't look real. In Australia, Lake Hillier stretches across the landscape in a shade of pink, so intense it feels artificial, as if someone had spilled paint across the surface. But it isn't a visual trick. The color doesn't shift with the light. It doesn't fade at sunset. It exists within the water itself. What creates it is not decoration, but survival. In conditions where salinity reaches extreme levels, most forms of life simply cannot persist. Yet some do. Microalgae like Dunaliella salina produce red pigments as a defense against radiation and chemical stress, slowly transforming the entire lake into something that looks impossible, but is entirely real. Thousands of kilometers away, in Bolivia's Dali Desert, the strangeness continues, but in a completely different form. Here, the color doesn't come from life, but from the earth itself. Layers of red, yellow, and orange stretch across the terrain, shaped over millions of years by minerals like iron and sulfur. The altitude makes breathing difficult, temperatures shift quickly, and the environment seems too harsh to sustain much of anything. And yet, life still finds a way. Flamingos move across saline lagoons scattered through the desert, though feeding on microorganisms that thrive under these exact conditions, so precisely adapted that they even influence the bird's color. Once again, the pattern repeats. The harsher the environment, the more specific the adaptation. And then, the direction changes completely. Some of the most extreme places on the planet aren't exposed at all. They're hidden beneath the surface. In deep cave systems, far below ground, light slowly disappears until it's gone entirely. And once sunlight is no longer part of the environment, the rules shift in ways that are almost difficult to imagine. Vision loses its value. In some species, it disappears altogether, not as a loss, but as an advantage. Maintaining eyes requires energy, and in a place where energy is scarce, nothing unnecessary survives. Fish navigate through darkness without sight and relying on subtle changes in water movement. Insects appear pale, almost translucent, their bodies adapted to a world where efficiency matters more than anything else. Everything is reduced to what is essential and nothing more. At first glance, these three places, Lake Hillier in Australia, the Dali Desert in Bolivia, and the deep cave systems hidden underground, seem completely unrelated. But they are connected by the same underlying rule. Each exists at the edge of what is possible. Each forces life to abandon the obvious and adapt in ways that seem almost improbable. And each one makes something clear from the very beginning of this journey. Extreme beauty rarely comes alone. It almost always arrives alongside pressure, isolation, scarcity, or risk. And the next environment follows that same idea. But this time, everything changes. Because now, the danger doesn't come from what's missing. It comes from too much. In contrast to environments where everything feels limited, hidden, or reduced to the essential, the next setting moves in the opposite direction. Here, the challenge isn't scarcity, it's excess. Deep within the Amazon rainforest, one of the most complex ecosystems on the planet, life doesn't just exist, it overflows. But this isn't the open, sunlit image often seen from above. The real dynamics unfold beneath the dense canopy, where light filters through in fragments and everything operates under constant pressure. At first, it can feel almost still, dense, layered, quiet. But that impression doesn't last. The forest floor is in continuous motion. Leaves fall, organic matter accumulates, and almost immediately, it begins to disappear. Insects, fungi, and microorganisms break everything down at remarkable speed, recycling nutrients back into the system. Nothing is wasted. Nothing stays in place for long. Survival here isn't about strength, but about timing and efficiency, about being part of a cycle that never stops. Within this overwhelming abundance, some species follow a different strategy. The giant anteater avoids direct competition and focuses on what others overlook, using its long, sticky tongue to reach deep into insect colonies, extracting thousands of ants and termites in minutes without confrontation, without waste, relying entirely on precision. But abundance comes with a cost. In a place where everything is alive, everything is also exposed. Predators don't need to search far. They're already present. Snakes remain hidden beneath layers of leaves. Jaguars move silently through the vegetation. Birds observe from above. Movement is constant, and being noticed is almost inevitable. The more life there is, the harder it becomes to go unseen. And this same principle doesn't stop at the forest. It extends into the ocean, where coral reef ecosystems create another environment defined by excess. At first glance, they appear calm, almost peaceful. But beneath that surface, everything is happening at once. Fish move in every direction, organisms occupy every available space, and interactions occur without pause. There is no emptiness, only constant activity. At the center of this system is a nearly invisible relationship. Microscopic algae live inside corals, converting sunlight into energy and sharing it with their host, while receiving protection and nutrients in return. It's an efficient balance, but also an extremely fragile one. When conditions remain stable, the reef thrives. But even small changes in temperature, acidity, or water quality can disrupt the system entirely. Corals lose their color, and the structure begins to weaken. And that reveals something important. Not every dangerous place looks hostile. Some appear vibrant, full of color, movement, and life. But beneath that appearance everything depends on a delicate balance, and when that balance shifts, the entire system responds. The Amazon rainforest and coral reefs, two completely different worlds, follow the same underlying rule. When there is too much, maintaining stability becomes the real challenge. And after so much activity, so much movement, and so much life concentrated in one place, the next environment breaks that rhythm almost completely. Because there, everything slows down. Sound fades, color disappears, and white begins to take over. After so much movement, density, and constant activity, the next environment shifts the rhythm almost entirely. Everything begins to slow down. Sound fades, color disappears, and white takes over the landscape. In the Arctic, ice is not just part of the environment, it defines how everything works. Here, the challenge isn't the absence of life, but how difficult it is to sustain it. Temperatures remain extreme, winds cut across the surface without interruption, and the ground itself is unstable, constantly shifting and breaking apart. Every movement carries a cost. A polar bear moves with precision, not by choice, but because it has to. Energy is limited. Hunting opportunities are rare, and failure isn't just a setback, it's a real risk. For days, sometimes longer, it may find nothing, crossing vast distances over ice that is never truly still. It cracks, drifts, separates, and reforms, constantly reshaping the possibilities of survival. Nothing here is fixed, even when everything looks frozen in place. And yet, the environment is far from empty. It's filled with subtle signals, almost invisible traces of life adapting in silence. Seals surface at precise points in the ice. Birds take advantage of short windows of opportunity, and every behavior depends on timing. Survival here isn't about dominating the environment. It's about understanding it with absolute precision. Further south, in Antarctica, the conditions remain just as extreme, but the strategy changes completely. The cold is just as intense, the wind just as relentless, but survival is no longer centered on the individual alone. It becomes collective. Penguin colonies gather tightly together, forming living structures that conserve heat in temperatures that could otherwise be lethal within minutes. They rotate slowly, those on the outer edges moving inward, while others take their place, creating a constant flow that allows the group to endure. It isn't random movement, it's a system. Each individual depends on the group, and the group only functions if every part adapts to the same rhythm. In this environment, staying still for too long can be just as dangerous as moving at the wrong moment. Balance is constant, dynamic, and precise. The wind never stops, the cold never fades, but organization allows life to persist. Two frozen extremes. They're two different strategies facing the same challenge. In one, survival depends on highly calculated individual decisions. In the other, it depends on coordination and collective behavior. But in both cases, the principle remains the same. Life doesn't remove the difficulty. It learns to exist within it. And just when it seems like cold has pushed everything to its limit, the planet shifts once again. Because the next environment isn't defined by ice, or wind, or isolation. It's defined by something that begins to disappear before anything else: the air. After environments where cold dictates every decision, the next setting shifts the challenge in a way that isn't immediately visible, but is impossible to ignore once it begins. Here, the problem isn't something you see, it's something you feel. In the Himalayas, the difficulty starts before any movement even happens. It's in the air itself. At extreme altitudes, breathing is no longer automatic. Every step requires more effort. Every action feels heavier. and the body is constantly working to compensate for the lack of oxygen. Survival here isn't just about endurance, it's about efficiency. Every movement must be calculated, every bit of energy preserved. And yet, some species don't just endure these conditions, they use them. Birds like the bar-headed goose cross these mountains at heights where most life wouldn't survive, taking advantage of rising air currents along the slopes to reduce energy expenditure. It isn't brute strength that allows this, it's precision. Adaptation refined to its absolute limit. But just as this environment reaches its peak of difficulty, the planet shifts again. Because in another part of the world, the challenge isn't the lack of air, it's the absence of cover. The African savanna stretches endlessly, open and exposed, with almost nowhere to hide. Visibility defines everything. Herds move constantly, not just in search of food, but as a strategy to reduce risk. More eyes mean better chances of detecting danger. But even then, there are no guarantees. Somewhere within that open landscape, predators are already watching, waiting, calculating. And when the moment comes, everything changes in seconds. Speed takes over. Instinct drives every movement, and what seemed stable becomes a direct struggle for survival. Mistakes here are not repeated, they are final. And still, the extremes don't end there, because there is a place where that same exposure is combined with an even more relentless pressure. In the Sahara Desert, survival isn't just about being seen, it's about enduring. Daytime temperatures rise to levels that make the environment nearly uninhabitable, forcing life to adjust in a completely different way. Many animals disappear during the hottest hours, retreating into shelter, slowing their activity, conserving every bit of energy. And when the temperature drops, the landscape transforms. The desert comes alive. Insects emerge. Small mammals begin to move. Predators return to action. Everything happens within a narrow window of time. Because here, survival isn't about being strong all the time. It's about knowing exactly when to act. 3 completely different environments: extreme altitude, total exposure, and relentless heat. Yet all of them demand the same thing: precision. None allow prolonged mistakes, and none forgive poor decisions. And if you've made it this far, you've probably noticed something important. These places don't follow a single rule. Each one tests life in a different way. So if this kind of exploration is holding your attention, it's worth continuing. Because what comes next shifts the focus once again. This time, the danger doesn't come from the environment first. It comes from what lives inside it. The shift now becomes more abrupt. Up to this point, the challenge came from climate, altitude, or exposure. Now, it comes from something else entirely. Here, it's not the environment that draws attention first. It's what lives within it. On certain islands in Indonesia, isolation has shaped a system with very few external influences, allowing life to evolve in ways that wouldn't happen anywhere else. Komodo Island may look like just another tropical landscape at first glance, with dense vegetation, heat, and rugged terrain. But there is one detail that completely alters its balance: the Komodo dragon. The largest lizard on Earth, and in this environment, a dominant predator with almost no direct competition. What makes it truly effective isn't just its size, but its strategy. It doesn't rely on long chases or bursts of speed. It observes, approaches carefully, strikes at the right moment, and then waits. Because here, time becomes part of the hunt. Its bite doesn't end the process, it begins it. Compounds in its saliva weaken the prey over hours, sometimes days, turning the environment itself into an extension of the predator's strategy. It doesn't need to pursue constantly. It needs precision, and that kind of efficiency only exists because of isolation. Without competing predators, without constant pressure, evolution followed a different path, shaping a system that operates under its own rules. But this kind of isolation isn't limited to land. In another part of the planet, it becomes even more extreme and far less visible. In the deep ocean, the rules change completely. Light disappears just a short distance below the surface, and as depth increases, all reference points fade away. There is no day or night here, only permanent darkness. And yet, life persists, but in ways that challenge everything we expect. Many creatures generate their own light. Brief flashes appear in the darkness, not randomly, but as part of a system. They attract prey, confuse predators, or allow communication in a place where vision is limited. Bioluminescence becomes a language, and that's only part of the adaptation. Pressure at these depths reaches levels that would make life impossible at the surface, yet here it is, the norm. Bodies become more flexible, structures adjust, metabolism slow and adapt to survive under constant compression. When these two environments are compared, a remote island like Komodo and the vast, unseen depths of the ocean, the same pattern emerges once again. When life remains isolated for long enough, it doesn't just adapt. It evolves in completely different directions. And that makes these places unpredictable, because they don't follow familiar rules. They create their own. And the most intriguing part is that, even after everything seen so far, this is only halfway through these 25 places. And what comes next shifts the type of challenge once again, because the next environment appears open, visible, almost easy to observe, and yet it operates under conditions where almost nothing should survive. After environments shaped by isolation, the next setting seems to follow a completely different logic. It isn't hidden, it isn't remote, and it isn't difficult to access. It's exposed, visible, and still operates under conditions that should prevent almost any form of life from surviving. In northern Tanzania, Lake Natron appears calm at first glance, with its still surface and reddish tones reflecting the surrounding landscape. But that calm is misleading. The water here is extremely alkaline, with chemical levels capable of harming most organisms that come into contact with it. Combined with intense heat, especially in shallow areas, the environment becomes highly hostile. It's not a place where life should thrive, and yet it isn't empty. Flamingos return once again, not just as visitors, but as residents. This is one of their main breeding grounds, and the reason is precise. The very conditions that make the lake dangerous also keep most predators away. What seems like a barrier becomes protection. It's a complete inversion of expectation. And there's another detail that makes this place even more unusual. Under certain conditions, the chemical composition of the water can preserve the bodies of animals, creating forms that appear frozen in time. It doesn't happen constantly, but when it does, it changes the entire perception of the environment. Then, the setting shifts again, almost like a direct contrast. The aggressive chemical environment fades, and something far more delicate seems to take its place. Along certain tropical coastlines, the ocean responds to movement in a way that feels almost unreal. At night, the water begins to glow, not from reflection, not from an external source, but from life itself. In bioluminescent beaches, millions of microscopic organisms emit light when disturbed. Each wave, each step, each movement creates flashes that appear and disappear in seconds. It may look calm, even peaceful, but this phenomenon serves a purpose. That light can act as a defense mechanism, attracting larger predators toward whatever caused the disturbance. It's an indirect response, but an effective one. And just when it seems that nature has already pushed this kind of behavior to its limits, there is another environment that expands this idea on an entirely different scale. In the Ross Sea, in Antarctica, the ocean reveals a different type of extreme. Cold, dense waters, often covered by ice for long periods, create the impression of emptiness. But that impression doesn't last. Beneath the surface, life organizes itself in precise cycles. When the ice retreats and light returns, activity increases rapidly. Microscopic organisms multiply, forming the base of a chain that supports fish, seals, and large marine mammals. Everything depends on timing. Three completely different environments: a chemically extreme lake, an ocean that reacts with light, and a frozen sea governed by cycles. And yet, all of them follow the same principle. The limit doesn't stop life. It defines how it exists. And when that pattern starts to repeat, predicting what comes next becomes more difficult. Because the next environment won't depend only on constant extreme conditions. It will depend on something far less predictable: time. In Death Valley, in the United States, the environment appears almost completely still. The ground is dry and cracked. Daytime temperatures rise to extreme levels, and for long periods, there are no visible signs of activity. Everything suggests a landscape in pause, as if nothing could sustain itself there for long. But that perception changes when time becomes part of the equation. What exists here hasn't disappeared. It's simply waiting. Seeds remain dormant in the soil for years, sometimes decades, enduring conditions that seem impossible. Rain alone isn't enough to trigger change. The amount must be sufficient. The timing must align with temperature. And when that combination finally occurs, the transformation is rapid. Within days, what once appeared lifeless becomes covered in color. Flowers emerge across vast areas, reshaping the entire landscape. It's a rare and unpredictable phenomenon, but when it happens, it reveals something essential. Life was never absent. It was paused. In another part of the world, that same dependence on precise timing appears in a completely different form. The Salar de Uyuni in Bolivia for most of the year looks like an endless white surface, flat and without clear reference points. But when a thin layer of water covers the ground, everything changes. The sky reflects with near-perfect clarity. The horizon disappears, and there is no clear distinction between above and below. Walking through it creates a disorienting sensation, or as if space itself has lost depth. And yet, even in this environment that appears empty, life persists in forms adapted to salt and environmental fluctuation. Once again, everything depends on the right moment. And when time stops acting as a rare trigger and becomes a constant force, the environment takes on a different dimension. In Yellowstone National Park, what defines the landscape isn't just what can be seen on the surface, but what lies beneath it. Thermal springs continuously release heated water filled with minerals, creating intense and vivid patterns of color. Geysers erupt at intervals that seem unpredictable, and the ground itself carries a constant sense of instability. Even here, life finds a way to adapt. Specialized microorganisms survive in extreme temperatures, and they are responsible for the colors visible in these geothermal features. Each shade represents a specific condition, almost like the terrain itself is revealing how it functions internally. When these three environments are connected, the pattern shifts once again. It's no longer just about climate, chemistry, or structure. It becomes about time, how it acts, how it waits, and how it transforms everything at exactly the right moment. And that idea prepares what comes next. Because now, the change won't be gradual, it will be immediate and impossible to ignore. Now the scale shifts once again. This is no longer about time acting slowly or changes that depend on the right moment. Here, transformation happens instantly, visibly, and with undeniable force. In different regions of the planet, active volcanoes represent this kind of environment. The ground itself becomes unstable, pressure builds beneath the surface, and when it is finally released, the impact is immediate. Lava flows outward, gases are expelled into the atmosphere, and the surrounding area becomes temporarily uninhabitable. It is destruction in motion. But that isn't where the process ends. Once the activity subsides, what remains is not just devastation, it is the beginning of something new. Fresh volcanic rock begins to be colonized by simple organisms like lichens and bacteria, slowly creating the foundation for more complex life to return. What once appeared completely sterile starts to rebuild itself. Destruction and creation are not separate events here. They are part of the same cycle. In another part of the world, however, the sense of strangeness doesn't come from force, but from long-term isolation. Socotra Island in Yemen feels almost disconnected from the rest of the planet. The shapes of its trees seem unfamiliar, as if they evolved without reference to anything else. Species found there exist nowhere else, shaped over millions of years in complete separation. They don't follow common biological patterns. They reflect what was possible within that isolated system. And that creates a landscape that feels almost alien at first glance, yet functions perfectly within its own rules. Following that same thread, the environment shifts again, this time defined by cold and distance. In the Siberian taiga, low temperatures persist for long periods, and isolation stretches across vast territories. Here, the challenge isn't only surviving the cold, it's managing scarcity. Resources remain limited for much of the year, forcing life to slow down, conserve energy, and adapt to long, rigid cycles. Nothing happens quickly, but everything follows a precise internal logic. 3 different environments, connected by the same principle: the force that transforms, the isolation that reshapes evolution, and the cold that slows everything down. In every case, the environment defines the limit, and life responds within it. And by now, it becomes clear that these places don't follow a simple pattern. Each one introduces a different kind of challenge, a different form of adaptation. And that's exactly what makes what comes next so different, because it doesn't just continue this pattern. It changes the way risk itself is understood, when now the nature of risk changes once again. Up to this point, the environment itself has been the dominant force. Cold, heat, pressure, isolation, all imposing clear and visible limits. But there are places where danger doesn't come only from physical conditions. It comes from how the environment is perceived. In Japan's Aokigahara forest, orientation is far more difficult than it seems. The density of the vegetation blocks visual references, sound behaves differently, and the landscape begins to repeat itself in subtle ways. Moving in the wrong direction for just a few minutes can be enough to lose any sense of position. It's not an aggressive environment at first glance, but that's exactly what makes it dangerous. The threat isn't obvious, and because of that, it's harder to recognize. Why, that same idea of isolation reaches an even more extreme level in another place where access is almost non-existent. North Sentinel Island in the Indian Ocean has remained isolated for thousands of years, protected not only by natural barriers like reefs and strong currents, but also by a deliberate absence of contact with the outside world. It is an environment where the usual rules do not apply, a place that cannot be explored freely and does not allow intrusion. It exists outside the reach of most human interaction, making it one of the most closed and inaccessible places on the planet. Following that same line, the ocean presents another form of risk, one that is far less predictable. In the region known as the Dragon's Triangle in the Pacific Ocean, conditions shift rapidly and without warning. Complex currents, underwater geological activity, and sudden environmental changes create an area where navigation becomes unstable. Unlike other environments, the danger here is not always visible before it happens, and when it appears, there is often little time to react. 3 very different places, connected by a single idea. Risk is not always defined by what the environment is, but by how difficult it is to interpret it correctly. When perception fails, the margin for error disappears. And when that uncertainty combines with something even more unexpected, the outcome changes completely. Because the next environment is no longer defined only by nature. It is defined by consequence. After moving through environments where nature defines every rule, the final setting introduces something deeper. Here, the danger doesn't come from climate, geography, or natural isolation. It comes from a disruption, something that wasn't originally part of the system. In Chernobyl, in Ukraine, the landscape tells a different kind of story. At first glance, it appears frozen in time. Buildings stand empty, structures slowly deteriorate, and objects remain exactly where they were left. But there is something present that cannot be seen, heard, or directly perceived. And yet it defines everything. Radiation, a form of risk that doesn't depend on visibility, but on persistence. And even so, life returned. Not in the same way, not under the same conditions, but it returned. Without constant human presence, the environment began to reorganize itself. Vegetation spread across concrete, roads slowly disappeared, and animals that would normally avoid human activity began to occupy the area. Wolves, deer, or birds, species that found space where there was once disturbance. And that changes the logic entirely. This is not a place where danger disappeared. It is a place where the balance shifted into something new. The absence of humans did not remove the risk. It integrated it into the system. Life didn't wait for ideal conditions. It adapted to what remained. And that makes this environment one of the clearest examples in this entire journey. Because after passing through extreme lakes, deserts, deep oceans, frozen regions, fire, isolation, and unpredictability, the last of these 25 places doesn't simply show how far nature can go. It shows what happens when balance is broken, and life continues anyway. After moving through all these environments, the way the planet is perceived begins to change. At first, they seemed like isolated places, on each one with its own logic, its own extremes, its own sense of unpredictability. A pink lake, mineral deserts, frozen regions, deep oceans, landscapes where air is scarce or heat dominates. But as they begin to connect, what emerges is no longer a collection of exceptions. It's a pattern. Every one of these places operates at the edge. Each one imposes a specific condition, sometimes visible, sometimes not, but always present. And in every case, life doesn't disappear. It adapts. It changes its rhythm, its form, its strategy. It doesn't try to reshape the environment. It finds a way to exist within it. And that reveals something deeper. The beauty seen in these places is not separate from the danger. It exists because of it. It is the direct result of extreme conditions functioning in balance. A balance that, in most cases, quite is far more fragile than it appears. Because sometimes, all it takes is a small shift for everything to change. And maybe that is what makes these places so difficult to ignore. They don't just show how far life can go, they show how dependent it is on very specific conditions. Nothing is permanent. Everything is constantly adjusting. And that leaves an open question. How many places like these still exist, operating silently, beyond what we fully understand? Because even now, there are parts of this planet we are only beginning to explore. And if this journey changed the way you see the natural world, it's worth continuing to explore further. There is always something beyond the next horizon. Another limit, another adaptation waiting to be discovered. And if you made it all the way here, which of these places surprised you the most? And where are you watching this from?